Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Hunting. I'm going to be talking to you this afternoon, if this works. There we go. I'm going to talk to you largely about education, but also there's a number of related topics that go very closely with that. That's workforce development and our state's economy, and then tied into all of that is our state's budget. So I'll be touching on all three of those as I go along, and hopefully it'll all hang together for you. There's an aspect of workforce development that doesn't get a lot of attention. I think it should, and that's the coming retirement of the baby boom generation. Over the next 10 years, we're going to lose about 20% of our workforce. And that's not just any part of our workforce. That is the boomers that are the most educated and highly trained and highly capable members of the people that drive our economy. And so it's going to be an interesting mix. We're going to lose about a quarter of our doctors and a quarter of our lawyers, a third of our psychologists, and almost half of our clergy. So it seems to me that there's a joke in there somewhere when all these people wander into a bar to celebrate their retirement. The bottom line is we need to get about 123,000 college-educated workers into Arizona's workforce over the next few years just to fill the shoes of the retiring boomers. And if we anticipate even modest levels of growth in the state, that number bumps up to about 250,000. So education is going to be a priority as we go forward in this state, getting 250,000 new workers into our workforce. So everyone likes to talk about growing the economy of a region and making us all more prosperous by attracting new business. And it's often hoped that we can draw business to our state by offering the right combination of tax incentives and low regulation and infrastructure like good roads, and even just having a nice quality of life like we have here in Arizona. Now, those are all factors certainly in driving our economy, but the data shows pretty clearly that what really matters for making a region economically prosperous and attractive to new business and to growing old business is the presence of a skilled workforce. And this makes sense if you think about it. Even if a company's tax rate were zero, that would be meaningless to them if they could not have workers to do the work there. So we need to have that educated workforce to drive our economy. I'm going to talk quite a bit here about the connection between education and prosperity as we go forward. So we all know that tomorrow's jobs are going to require more in the way of education and training and not less. But don't let that fool you into thinking that people coming into the workforce are going to have a degree in computer science in order to put food on the table. There's a much more interesting picture than that. Even in the most educated areas of the country, most of the jobs are held by people that do not have college degrees. Bear that in mind. We focus a lot on college degrees, but there's a lot of career and technical qualifications that I have come to believe are very important in driving the economy of the future. These people are very highly skilled, very highly trained, but they do not have a bachelor's degree. We track bachelor's degrees rate, and we're very concerned about those. There's a lot of data on that. There's not much data on those career and technical qualifications that are very important. But those people are a critical part of our workforce going forward. So if we could get numbers on high-skilled machinists and welders and things like that, it would track very closely to what I'm going to talk about here with college graduates. So just bear in mind, this is sort of a proxy. the reason we are so concerned with higher education qualifications for a workforce is that the data is very clear on this, that if you can drive up the percentage of college-educated workers in a region, wages improve for everybody, not just for the college graduates. People that are college dropouts living in areas with large numbers of college graduates make more money than those in lesser educated places. It works out to, if you figure a 1% increase in the bachelor's degree rate in your workforce translates into $1,000 a year into the pocket of everybody, every worker in the state. So, how's Arizona doing on this? This is a map of bachelor's degree attainment rate for the U.S. The national bachelor's degree rate in the workforce is about 28%. Arizona's a little under that at 26%. But we can take a little more detailed picture here. If we zoom into the counties, you can see that Coconino, Maricopa, and Pima counties actually have education rates slightly above the national average. And if we zoom into the state and look at the metropolitan areas, we see an even more interesting picture. You can see here that places like Prescott and Flagstaff are very highly educated, as is the Southeast Valley, and that's Oro Valley north of Tucson that's standing out. And down there in the southeast corner of the state is Fort Huachuca. Anybody know what's going on there? Despite all the jokes that we make, you need a lot of smart people to do military intelligence, and that's what they do at Fort Huachuca. It's actually one of the more educated places in the state. So the lesson from this is that the economic conditions of an area drive that education number. So a 12% bachelor's degree rate in Greenlee County may not be really a problem, right? They need a few college-educated engineers working in the mines at Morenci. What they really need, though, is a lot of highly trained, highly skilled, but not necessarily college graduates running the heavy machinery in the mines. It's a different sort of way to look at it. So you see Greenlee County, 12% rate. Southeast Valley, they've got a lot of college-educated people working at Intel, right? So the educational background of a region reflects the economy of that region. So now I'm going to talk, I got ahead of myself here. Let's back up. How do I go back? Previous, that's what I want. No? The computer is being... Okay. So this is a series of slides that really highlights that connection between education and prosperity in a region. Let me tell you what you're looking at here. Each dot on this chart is a state. And the time frame here is 1960. And across the bottom, I've got the bachelor's degree rate for each of these states. And up on the vertical axis is the per capita personal income, which is a measure of the prosperity of the state. And you can see here that the states with a lower bachelor's degree rate have lower incomes, and states with a higher bachelor's degree rate have a higher income. That's just what we talked about earlier. Now, the sharp-eyed among you will note that the average bachelor's degree rate here in 1960 is around 9%. And a few slides ago, I told you that our bachelor's degree rate in the U.S. is now 28%. And that's right. And that's part of the reason this is such a great country. Because between 1960 and 2010, we increased our bachelor's degree rate in this country by 3.5 times. The least educated state today has considerably more bachelor's degree holders than the most educated state in 1960. You'll also note that even though this is in inflation-adjusted dollars, that the average income is pretty low, right? About $15,000. It's a lot more than that now. That's another reason this is such a great country. What we have done since 1960 is made a large share of our population educated and wealthy. So I'm going to animate these dots, and you're going to see our trajectory through time here and see what happens. Before I do that, I want to highlight 2 points here. This red triangle is Arizona, and the blue diamond is the national average. So you can see in 1960, Arizonans were a little bit poorer than the nation as a whole, but we were actually more educated. Arizona had about a 9% bachelor's degree rate versus a little less than 8% for the nation as a whole. So let's set these in motion and see what happens. There we go. Arizona is falling behind. So let me isolate these, and I'll show it year by year. This is Arizona versus the nation as a whole. As I said, in 1960, Arizona is a little bit poorer, but more educated than the nation as a whole. In 1970, we've closed some of that income gap, and we are getting more and more educated. By 1980, we've started to, things are still increasing, but not by as much in the education realm. 1990, for the first time, our education level drops to the national average, and our income has started to go along with it. By 2000, we've dropped below the national average for the first time, and our income has started a pretty obvious decline. And 2010, the trend is pretty clear here. Now, I don't want to be too negative about this. We can't think that this trajectory that Arizona has been on is somehow inevitable. The decisions that have been made regarding our income and our education levels are the result of many decades of policy decisions, business decisions, personal decisions. All sorts of aspects have gone into this, and it's not inevitable. It can be changed, and the green line on here sort of illustrates this. This is the line for Colorado. Colorado's always been an educated state, but in the 70s and again in the 90s, they really accelerated that. They put a lot of resources into their higher education system, and you can see that in the recession of 2008, they were fared much better than Arizona did. So now I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about the state budget. And the reason I have to do this is because education is such an important part of the budget. And we hear every year about the crises of getting that state budget balanced. And here's why. K-12 education is about 43% of the state's general fund. If you throw the universities in there, education as a whole is 50% of the state's general fund. That's the barrel of money that they have to have balanced at the end of the day. So whenever anyone talks about changes to the state budget, it's going to be in education because it's such a large portion of the budget. I'd also like you to call attention to the fact that over 90% of the state budget is consumed by just 7 agencies. Okay, so K-12 education, the universities, Access, Department of Health Services, Department of Economic Services, and Department of Child Services, and then corrections, the prisons. 10% of the budget goes to everything else, to 100 agencies. This is 100 agencies in here. So when the budget gets out of balance and people say, well, let's just do away with the Office of Tourism, or let's eliminate the Department of Environmental Quality, you could do that, but with a budget of $1 billion, eliminating Department of Environmental Quality isn't really going to address the problem. There's just simply not enough money there. When the budget's out of balance, these 7 agencies, and primarily K-12 education and the universities especially, have to take that brunt. The other thing about this from a policy perspective is that all 7 of these agencies have budgets that are determined by their caseload and not by policy decisions made in the Capitol, really. If someone is convicted of a crime and sentenced to prison, you have to pay for that person. A child shows up first day of kindergarten, you have to pay for that person. Someone is eligible for access, you pay for that person. It doesn't matter anything else, the state is still committed to that. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to get that budget balanced every year. So let's talk a little bit about the state's budget. This is a graph of the general fund revenue for the state going back to 1990. This graph alarms a lot of people because it seems to show that the state budget has tripled in size since 1990. We're going from about $3 billion to $9 billion over that time. Well, it's a little bit simplistic. Over that time, there's about 3% inflation per year. So if we take that into account, the line looks a little better. But you'd still say, well, we're going from $6 million to $9 million. That's still a large increase in the state budget over that time. Anyone that has lived in the state since 1990 knows that things have changed quite a bit, right? So I'm going to add another line here. This is our population. You can see that our population has gone up quite a bit. When that population comes in, there's an increased demand for services, for schools, and everything else in there. That drives a lot of that budget. This line also illustrates something that is often hard for people to understand about taxation and public policy, and that is that we do not tax people. We tax economic activity in the state, right? If we taxed people, the line would parallel that red population line. For this audience, I will have you know that there have been times in cultures where people were taxed, a head tax on people, and that's why Joseph had to take his wife to Bethlehem, because the Romans had a head tax. So who says tax policy is boring? We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for that. So you can see, back to reality now, you can see in the 90s, our tax revenue and population tracked pretty closely. And then right here, that's the dot-com boom and bust. And right after that, very obviously, you can see the housing bubble when everyone was buying new houses and cars, taking equity out of their properties, and it all worked great until 2008 when the wheels fell off the bus and we had big problems. So, I got one ahead of myself again here. So if you really want to look at the size of a state budget and the revenue that's coming in, you need to scale the numbers to the size of the economy. So what I've done here is put the state general fund revenue over that time as a portion of the economy. So this is the amount of dollars collected by the state per $1,000 of personal income. So you can see it peaked in about 1992 at right around $50 per $1,000 in personal income went to the state government. Then we started cutting taxes, and we are now down to about $32. Is it 32 or 30? $34 per $1,000 personal income goes to the state government through your taxes. So what we see here is that those that have been trying to shrink government and lessen the tax burden on the people of Arizona have really done a very effective job. We're collecting 32% less taxes as a share of the economy in this state than we were in 1992. It's counterintuitive, right? Because we all like to complain about our taxes, but in reality, they have gone down. Now, this is just state taxes. Federal and local taxes are a different matter, maybe a little different. But that's the reality of where we're at here. Now, that has implications, of course, for education. And that's this green line here. That's our education spending as a portion of the economy. We peaked in 1997 at about $19 per 1,000 personal income, and we've now dropped down to just over $14. So we've had a decrease in our state commitment to education by 24% since 1997. It's also important to mention that in 1997, at the peak of our educational funding, we were 48th in the nation on per pupil funding, and we are now 50th in the nation. So let's take a look at how Arizona compares to the rest of the nation. As I said, we're 50th in the nation. This is instructional spending. This is just spending in the classroom on a per pupil basis. So about $4,000 per pupil. We're 29 or 30% under the national average. Now, the governor has suggested that one way we could address this problem is by diverting money that now goes towards administration expense into the classroom. So let's look and see how that would work out. Here is our administration expense. This is both school and district level expense. So this is the whole shebang there. And we are also last in the nation for administrative expense. So let's see what would happen if we went back and applied all of that administrative expense to the classroom. So let's imagine that we're going to fire every principal, every school superintendent, every cafeteria worker, and every custodian in the state. And we're going to stack that number on top of that green bar that is Arizona's. We go from 50th to 47th. You can see that there may be some efficiencies we can gain there, but not a lot. I'd also like to point out that this is quite a bit more money than the $350 million a year that the governor is proposing to get into our education system from the state trust land sales reform. So what's going on here? What's driving all this, right? This is a chart. You probably can't read all the things here. This is teacher pay. 80% of the educational budget goes to teacher pay. So that's really the big driver. So this is 10th percentile, 25th median, 75th percentile, and 90th percentile of pay. For Phoenix and Tucson, red is Tucson, blue is Phoenix, and a bunch of comparison cities, Denver, Atlanta, Salt Lake City, and the green bar there is the United States. So you can see that we really do pay our teachers less across the board than other states, other regions, and especially in those higher brackets, the 75th and 90th percentile, which you can probably assume are the most senior teachers, the teachers that have been around the most, and we would hope anyways would be the most capable. So that appears to be the hang up there on our education funding. So I've just hit you with a whole barrage of graphs, and I'll spare you any more this time. But if I were going to show you graphs now, what I would do is show you the correlation between education spending and prosperity. Now, I won't get into the exciting aspects of partial correlation coefficients and adjusted R-squares, but it's really cool stuff, let me tell you. But what that shows really is that states that spend more on education have more robust economies, and they have generally better quality of life for their residents. Of course, correlation does not always imply causation, as the old cliche goes, but I like to say that correlation does wink suggestively and say, hey, buddy, look over here. This is where things are probably happening. So I've taken a look over the years several times at how we're doing on education funding Relative to other states, as I said, we are 50th in the nation, but what does that really mean? You hear that a lot. What's the real magnitude of that? From 2002 to 2013, we decreased our education funding by 6% per pupil. Policymakers are likely to tell you, hey, that's not too bad, considering that we had this really terrible, terrible recession in this state. We cut our education funding by only 6%. The rest of the nation increased their funding by 8% during that time. If you believe that we are in a globally connected economy and that we are competing with every other state for things like Tesla factories and Google headquarters, that may not be such a good deal. So our per pupil funding is 29% below average. And you would ask yourself, what would that really cost to get us to the average? This is not top 10, this is to the average of funding. That's $3.8 billion per year. Remember, we are now arguing over whether or not we have the finances to restore $300 million, less than a tenth of this amount in interest that is due. So that's a really big hole to be in. It's going to be decades before we get out of this problem. It took us decades to get into it. So I think even the most wild-eyed liberal is not going to say we should have a $3.8 billion tax increase. But what would that mean if we were to do that? I ran some back-of-the-envelope calculations on that, and I can tell you what it is, but before I do, I need you all to promise me that you will not go home and say that Dan Hunting of the Morrison Institute is advocating a tax increase of this size, all right? This is just to show you where we're at. Median taxpayer would pay about $500 a year to get us up to that. That would get us $3.8 billion a year. If your income is in the $40,000 to $50,000 a year range, about $900 a year. We've actually done some polling at Morrison Institute on this issue. We find that 8 in 10 Arizonans agree that we are not spending enough on education, and over 60% would be willing to pay $200 a year to address the situation. So that's something that I think we're going to look at as we go forward. And my sense of just keeping my ear to the ground out in the public and even in the political circles is that there's starting to be some thought about addressing this. You can see that with the governor's state trust land reform issue, and the superintendent of public instruction has come out with some plans. So I think this is starting to get on the agenda in Arizona, and we're likely to see some, at least marginal change coming in the next few years. So I don't want to be all gloom and doom here. I've just been sort of gloomy so far. So I'm going to give you some really interesting research that I've done recently that's got some very cool sort of bright spots in it. I was given the opportunity to look into post-high school outcomes for Latino and low-income students. So we broke this population up into 3 groups. The group we were most interested in originally is this little silver band here. Those are really the most highly achieving students. These are students that are 90th percentile on their ACT score with a GPA of 3.5 or better. So they are smarter than almost everybody in this room. Yeah. The slide is labeled Latino students here. I broke it down by both Latino and low-income students. It was fascinating to see that those two populations, Latino and low-income, were statistically identical. So every time you hear me say Latino for the next few slides, you could substitute low-income and it would be the same thing. So what you can see here is that the slice of that silver pie that is the highest achieving students is much smaller on that Latino demographic. for whatever reason, if you are low income or Latino, your chances of being in that highly income or highly achieving status in high school are about 1/5 of the peers. So our education system clearly needs to do some work to address the issues there on what's going on with that population. But we have some really interesting good news if we drill down. What I'm going to do here is drill down into this silver slice and see what happened to those highly achieving students after high school. So there they are. The gray slice are those that did not go to college at all. The red went to community college. The big sort of yellowish slice went to an in-state university. And the olive colored went to an out-of-state university. Now, if you'll notice this, the Latino pie is a smaller pie. Like we said, there's a lot fewer of them in that thing. But their slices of pie within that are about the same size, right? These two populations are statistically identical, that low income and Latino students, if they can get into that highly achieving status, their post-high school outcomes are absolutely identical to their non-Latino and higher income peers. That says to me a couple of things. First of all, we have programs in this state that are identifying these students and offering them opportunities, such as scholarships and things like that. These kids have probably been identified by their teachers and counselors and parents since they were very young that, hey, you're a smart kid, you need to go to college, and that's working. And we also cannot discount the fact that these are very, very smart people, that they're able to figure out how to get to college, right? People have been telling them, hey, you can do this. They're smart enough to figure out how to jump through those hoops. So this is, I think, a really good sign of hope for the future in Arizona. But now let's go back and look at this big purple slice. This is a slice of people I call bright but not brilliant. They're as smart as you and I are, right? These are kids that are probably qualified to get into ASU or U of A. So let's see what happens there. First of all, you'll notice that the low-income and Latino slice is a little bit smaller. So there's a disparity there as well between achievement in high school. It's not quite as broad as it was with the highly achieving students. There's still an issue. It's not as bad, though. So let's drill down and see what happened to those guys after school. First thing you notice here is that our Latino pie is almost the same size as this, right? We have a very large Latino population in this state. And the slices are arranged differently. The pies don't look quite the same here. The low-income and Latino students are less likely to go to college, less likely to go to an in-state university or a out-of-state university. They're actually a little more likely to go to community college, which is kind of interesting here. So what this tells me is that this is a real opportunity. This is a large population. This is the population that I was talking about in those first slides. This is the population that is going to fill the shoes of the retiring boomers, right? This is our taxpayers of the future. So if we can figure out how to get this population to perform as well as those highly achieving students, those really brilliant students, we will have done a great thing in this state. There's a real chance there to motivate that. I tell people that if I walk out of here today and buy a winning lottery ticket, I am going to start a scholarship program for B students, that the A students are taken care of. It's these B students that we need to get over the line and get energized and activated in our workforce. So, just to sum up here a little bit, it's pretty clear that Arizona's education is not about race or ethnicity, parental involvement, any of that kind of stuff. What it's really about is poverty. That is what is driving the disparities there, I think. And we have a disproportionate number of Latinos living in poverty. As Linda Manning will tell you in a little while, Latinos are the fastest growing part of our demographics. That is who we are, one way or another. These are the people that are going to be paying taxes in the future. They are going to be pushing my wheelchair when I am in the retirement home in a few years. That is our fate. There are no longer Latino and non-Latino issues in Arizona. There are only Arizona issues, but they happen to have a Latino future. So that's where we are going. So I think we should embrace that. And there's real economic incentive to do that. If we can cut our dropout rate in half, we're looking at $31 million annually, at least, with a lot of disposable income to go along with that. So finally, education is the key to our economic success for Arizona and everybody. And I think Arizona, with the success we've already shown in our highly achieving Latino populations and our emerging Latino demographic, I think we have a chance here to really be a model for the nation in using the rising of that class and getting them into the economy, fully engaged through education. We have an opportunity to get them engaged and to make this state a much better place as we go forward. And that's all I have.